The Legend of Zelda games are defined by a lot of things: their memorable characters, overarching storylines, incredible music, and of course, puzzles, which are most often found throughout the series' dungeons. These structures are an incredibly important aspect of the series. After all, in most games, clearing these dungeons is what drives the games forward, and I don't think it's a hot take to say that in recent times, the dungeons of these games have been really disappointing. Breath of the Wild is an incredible game, but one of its most common criticisms is that the dungeons are really bad. And while yes, its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, definitely improves on them, most people agree that they're still very lacking. Going into Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, I personally had zero expectations. I saw the announcement trailer when it dropped in June, and from then on out I watched basically no other pre-release trailers and such, so that I could go in as blindly as possible. Considering this game's main gimmick is that you play as Zelda instead of Link, I was expecting it to be as different from usual 2D Zelda games as possible, and given the series' recent track record when it comes to dungeons, I was expecting them to just not be in the game at all, at least not how they traditionally work. So when I stumbled into Southern Ruins at the start of the game, found a map, solved tons of puzzles, found a big key, fought a boss, and obtained a heart container at the end, I said to myself, wow, that was an honest-to-goodness Zelda dungeon, and it wasn't bad. So yes, this game has dungeons, and unfortunately the quality of them was kind of all over the place. But that's not to say they're all bad. So today I want to go over all 8 dungeons found in this game and see if traditional Zelda dungeons are finally back in all their glory. Speaking of dungeons, this video is sponsored by Infinity Nikki, which has dungeons. Great segue, right? This is the upcoming 5th installment of the beloved Nikki series, which has an interesting concept, namely that it's a cozy adventure game with a big focus on outfit collection, and said outfits give you different abilities, allowing for tons of different gameplay styles. Basically, it's Zelda meets Barbie, which is not something I'd ever come up with, but it ends up working pretty well. There are outfits that allow for platforming, outfits for grooming animals, and even outfits for fishing, and you know every good game has a fishing mechanic in it, right? And like I said, there are even dungeons filled with puzzles to find all throughout the open world. And if you're watching this video, I know you're a fan of dungeons. There are even some boss fights, which is pretty nuts for a game that's described as being cozy. All of this is of course on top of the outfit collecting, of which there are tons to find, and I think they look pretty great. This game actually utilizes Unreal Engine 5 to make the materials look better and flow more realistically, so you know they put a lot of care into these fits. So if the game looks interesting to you, go check out the link in the description for more info and maybe even pre-order it. Shoutouts to Infinity Nikki for supporting the channel today, and now let's go talk about some Zelda dungeons, shall we? So the way this is gonna work is that I'm gonna go over each dungeon from worst to best, at least in my opinion, so that we can start with the fun negative stuff and slowly make our way to more positive stuff. You've seen ranking videos before, you know how this works by now. Also, spoilers! This video spoils the entirety of the game, obviously, just throwing this warning out before I get any comments about it. Anyways, with that all aside, we'll obviously be starting with what I think is easily the worst dungeon in this game. Number 8, Jabul Ruins. It's just not good, man. So for this being the game's designated water dungeon, it really doesn't do anything interesting with water at all. The main idea here is that there's this water basin in the central room that constantly sucks the water up and spits it out into a water pillar. You need to find buttons in the dungeon that each pours more water into the basin, thus resulting in a taller water pillar, eventually letting you reach the boss at the top. The 4 buttons you need to find are each at the end of a small series of rooms. You can choose the first 2 in any order you want, same with the last 2, which means this dungeon boils down to just 4 small series of rooms you can kinda tackle in a loose order. These rooms just aren't very exciting either. One of them is a dark underwater 2D maze, which is kinda trivialized by the fact that you can just see the exact path to take on the map. One of them is focused on combat, which is boring cause since it's by water you just drop some fish echoes in the water and wait, or you bind the jumping enemies and wait. One of them is a 2D underwater segment with some obstacles where the answer is literally always to just blow it up with a bombfish. Like that's always the answer. And then the last one is a small platforming challenge on floating rafts, followed by a room that's almost interesting, but is ruined by what I think is this game's single worst designed aspect, the cardinal sin that is the water block echo. You get this echo on your way to this dungeon, and it breaks the entire game apart. You can stack these blocks by just placing more in the same spot, which absolutely trivializes all the platforming in this game, and you're expected to use it, by the way. Like I said, you get it on your way to the dungeon, and the area here is specifically designed around using it, so you can't even make the argument that it's optional to get. They want you to get it. Back to that room I said was almost interesting. The idea here is that it's a big room with water and a bunch of targets you have to hit. Most of these targets are high up above the water, so you have to find ways to get to them. Now, like I said, the water blocks always trivialize this sort of thing, but they actually tried limiting you here by making the water in this room be flowing, which means you can't place water blocks in it. I don't see any other reason why the water here would be flowing, so that must be their intention. But even then, you can just start using the water blocks on the solid ground near the switches, getting to them pretty easily. So even when the devs try to limit the sheer power of water blocks, they just bust it anyways. That's the main problem with the water blocks. Anytime you need to get any amount of height in this game, water blocks are by far the best and quickest solution, every single time. And while it doesn't matter for this dungeon, water blocks can even break combat, believe it or not. Almost no enemy in this game can swim, so you can just grab an enemy, place a water block down, and drag them into it, killing them instantly. Water blocks truly are the key to every problem in this game. In my first playthrough, I had to actively stop myself from using them to have any fun with this game's platforming, which is a shame because I think puzzles where you need to gain some height are some of this game's best aspects. Of course, you can make the argument of if you don't like it, don't use it, but I think that's a cheap excuse to justify something that just should not have been this strong of an option. In this game's marketing, they heavily push the find your own solution to puzzles concept, which is an idea I'm just not a fan of. Tears of the Kingdom gets criticized for that concept, so I think this game should be too. Anyways, long rant aside, getting back to the actual dungeon, after all those puzzles, you finally reach the boss, Vocavor. And sadly, I think this fight is also extremely lacking. Because Echoes of Wisdom doesn't really put an emphasis on combat, bosses in this game are usually more puzzle focused. Block its rush attacks with something, dodge its projectiles on small platforms, attack with its alternating weaknesses. But this boss is the biggest exception to that rule. Its weakness, the bumps on its back, are always exposed, and you're really just not stopped from going full aggro on it at all. Just get above it, smack it a few times, it swims away, get above it again, smack it again, and repeat until it's dead. At one point it does remove parts of the water, actually allowing it to attack for once. But after that it turns upside down to let you attack it, and after that it just goes back in the water at the bottom, allowing you to attack and kill it. It literally got to attack once. Like, cool fight, bro. Also, it creates water torrents while not in water. How does that make sense? Anyways, before we move on, I do want to mention that this dungeon actually starts kind of interestingly. The very first room here is just a hallway that breaks apart when you walk on it, dropping you down into a 2D water segment, where you get chased by the boss's attacks as you have to swim away. Like, that's pretty cool. I like that you get a run-in with the boss at the start before you fight it at the end. You're also allowed to skip this whole segment if you know it's coming, leading to something fun to try on a second playthrough, so I'll give this dungeon that. It does start pretty strong. It's just a shame that everything that comes after that kind of blows. My god, can we please have a good water dungeon in the next Zelda game? They're 3 for 3 now in just being absolutely miserable parts of their respective games. Anyways, moving on. Number 7, Gerudo Sanctum. This is a big improvement over Jabul Ruins, but I still don't think it's very good. The first thing that sticks out about this dungeon to me is that it's the only one in the game to not have a little platforming segment in the still world before it. Instead, when you jump in, you're immediately in the dungeon. And that's because partway through, you leave the dungeon, revealing that the whole building is inside the still world, and that part of this dungeon takes place on the outside. I think that's a really cool concept, but sadly it kind of falls flat in execution. You only go out once to collect a couple things, and then you go back in and you don't have to go outside anymore. To be fair, there is also a small treasure room here on the outside you can climb into through a window, and there's another treasure room inside the dungeon that seemingly has no entrance, because you actually have to dig a hole to it from the outside. That's really cool, but again, I just wish they ended up doing more with it that's actually required. The real main gimmick of this dungeon is that there's a room that tells you to seek out 2 distinct tributes, with clues to the desired tributes being somewhere on this floor, which translates to there being a couple statues for you to find, namely a snake, a cat, an elephant, and an owl, and that you have to figure out which 2 of these 4 you need to place here. There's a couple problems with this. First of all, one of these 2 hints is literally in the next room, and second off, there's only 4 statues in total here, so by knowing one of them so early on, you can just brute force the other side by trying the remaining 3 statues until the door opens. I wish there were just way more statues to find, or that putting the wrong 2 in would spawn some enemies or something, or maybe even change which 2 statues you'll need to place down. Also changing what's written on the hint stones, making it so you actually have to go find them and put the knowledge from them to use. If it was random each playthrough, I think it would actually make for a really cool dungeon. Other than that, this is an extremely straightforward dungeon, with not a lot to comment on. At the start you get the Flying Tile Echo, which is sadly a way too powerful echo as well that once again lets you just ignore a lot of this dungeon's design, but I don't think it's as bad as the water block since it doesn't let you get crazy height, and this dungeon doesn't really focus on platforming anyways, but it's still a shame that the Flying Tile lets you fly past the little platforming that is here. Something that makes no sense to me is that you see the boss door submerged in sand, but you literally can't get the boss key without also removing the sand, since the key is also buried under the same sand. Like, what's the point of the sand being there? It changes literally nothing. Last thing to mention is that all the fights in this dungeon are underwhelming. The Link mini-boss is super annoying since he constantly runs away to fire arrows at you. At first I thought you had to block his path to corner him or something, which would be cool, but no, he can just jump over all the walls. Instead, it seems like his AI randomly just stops working, letting you attack him for free. And the boss, Mawgriff, is just so boring. It's one of those fights where they go through some scripted attacks you just have to wait out, then he does a move that lets you stun it, letting you attack it, and then repeat, meaning the majority of this fight is spent waiting for him to do a specific move. In phase 2, some of the sand gets replaced with quicksand and it starts flying around, but it barely changes the fight at all. He just gets access to more slow moves you have to wait out, until he does the same rush move that lets you stun him. For a guy called Mawgriff, he's really not mogging anyone. I'm so sorry. Before we move on, quick intermission. Please subscribe if you like this type of content since I plan to make more of it. In fact, you can already know ahead of time what I'm making by supporting me on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. Okay, back to the ranking. Number 6, Null's Body. Alright, this is kind of a weird one. I was originally not sure if I should even count this dungeon since for the most part this place just focuses on the final boss fight, but there is some stuff before it, and including it just gives me a bit more to talk about, so here we are. The gimmick here is that you lose access to Sword Fighter form, but in turn you're accompanied by Link, who's fully controlled by some custom AI they made for him here, and he has the full moveset of your Sword Fighter form. While I absolutely love this idea, I sadly think they dropped the ball kinda hard with it. Before the final boss here, they don't do anything interesting with it at all. There's one single puzzle where you actually have to interact with Link, and even then it's not very exciting. You're on one side of a grating and you have to somehow get Link up a big wall on the other side so he can push a button. You could do some super intricate echo placements to make a path for him, or you can just grab him with bind and jump a bit to get him up there. It's really not very hard. Other than that, you don't have to interact with Link at all. There's a part where you both have to do some fighting separately from each other, and a part where you have to do a small puzzle while Link gets to literally do nothing. If anything, this segment just makes me hope for a 2D co-op Zelda game like this in the future, where one player controls Link and the other Zelda with different playstyles to solve puzzles together and such. That'd be really cool. Also, I just want to point out that it's hilarious how often Link stops to nod at you slowly. Like, he literally does it 11 separate times here. It almost feels like a joke by the developers. There's one instance where he looks in your direction without nodding at you, and I thought it was because there's a wall in between you two in that room, but before that point there's another instance of there being a wall between you two where he nods anyways, which might be an oversight. Regardless, it makes the one time where he doesn't nod even funnier. Anyways, like I said, the main meat of this place is the final battle against Null, for which you're of course also teamed up with Link. And I have to give some serious props to the developers here for Link's AI. You have to pull on Null's arms one by one, stretching them out so Link can cut them off, and no matter what Link is doing, when you pull on one of those arms, he'll drop anything to run up to it and do a jumping spin attack to cut it off. Seriously, think about it. If Link's AI wasn't as reliable here as it is, this could have easily become an extremely frustrating fight. I'm sure some speedrunners could point to a couple cases where he wasn't super reliable, but for the most part the Link AI is more than serviceable in this fight. I enjoy phase 2 a lot as well because you and Link get separated, and it's in a 2D water segment. It's legit pretty intense since you only have a couple fish echoes to rely on for damage, and you have to manage your air meter, all while dodging water tornadoes and making sure your fish friends aren't dying. They did a great job on this part. However, I'm gonna ruin this phase for you forever now. The way the developers programmed this phase is that all damage you do to Null here actually doesn't do anything. Instead, the game wants Null to swim a specific distance in this 2D segment, and once it gets far enough, any hit will finish the phase. So you can literally just ignore the boss entirely until Null passes this specific ceiling bump, and from here on out, any single hit will end the phase. It's kind of stupid that they made it work like this, but at the same time it's also really funny, and I personally don't think it ruins the phase at all, cause no first time player is ever gonna know about that. Phase 3 on the other hand is the only part of this fight that I do have some legitimate problem with. I love everything about it except for just how fast Null keeps going into the ground to summon bosses to attack you. That itself is cool, but you have to pull off a ton of arms this phase, and it just takes forever because he flees to summon bosses after almost every arm you remove. And this phase has 3 phases in of itself. I do really like the end though, where you try to pull out the Triforce of Power from null, and Link runs up to help you pull. Feels like a giant reference to Spirit Track's final boss, and that ending is incredible, so yeah, big win in my book. I'm pretty much mostly positive on this place. I even get why there's only one puzzle. They couldn't make this dungeon too long because you can't save the game at all during it, since you lose access to Sword Fighter form. And they obviously don't want to force players to have to finish a long dungeon in one sitting. So it makes sense that it's not entirely clear if this should even count as a dungeon or not. So I don't think I can rank it any higher than this. Just know that I personally think it's better than the following 2 dungeons I'm gonna talk about, but I'm trying to be at least a little objective in this video with my ranking. Number 5, Eldin Temple. Now we're finally getting into some good stuff. Emphasis on some good stuff. Let's start with the positives here. First of all, the song in this dungeon is like really good and fitting. I like it a lot. As for the dungeon's actual design, it's pretty open. You have multiple paths to take constantly. You can even get multiple small keys at some point if you take specific paths, which is really rare for Zelda games. When you get the boss key at the bottom of a tall 2D room, lava starts rising and you have to quickly make your escape. It's really hard to make chase sequences like this actually exciting since they almost always give you way too much time, which at first seems to be the case here as well, but as you approach the ladder to the exit, it breaks, forcing you to quickly think of a way to make it to the other side. I think I came up with a very fast solution, and the lava still got decently close to catching up with me. It legit wouldn't surprise me if this caught a few people off guard and actually failed it. The chest containing the map has both 3 vertical and 3 horizontal hot air geysers blocking it, and you can choose either path to take. That also stood out to me as some fun design. The Link fight here I'm a bit more mixed on. He only uses bombs, but it seems like again his AI randomly decides to stop attacking you, letting you get some free damage in. And when he does manage to hit you, it does a ton of damage, but it also blows up some rocks in the ground, which contain hearts for you to heal that damage right back up. So I don't really see the vision here. And speaking of bombs, you get them after this fight, and I think they're handled terribly here. First of all, they obviously cost energy from your sword gauge, since you can only use them while in sword fighter mode, and they have a really small explosion radius, forcing you to keep going in and out of sword mode to preserve meter. And every room that wants you to use bombs has infinitely respawning little crystals to refill your sword meter extremely slowly. So they really are expecting players to just chip away at all the breakable walls while collecting meager bits of sword meter at a time. That's just annoying design. All of this can be bypassed by just using Bombfish, which every player will have since Jabul Ruins comes before this dungeon. They blow up way quicker, are way quicker to summon, and don't cost a resource at all. There's also one bomb throw here that's stupidly precise, like you need to stand on the very edge of a platform for the bomb to land where it needs to. Why didn't they design it like this or something? Or this? You'd have to throw a bomb either way. At the very start of the dungeon is a small room with a breakable block in it that I feel like they only put there to entice the player to come back to it once they get bombs. But again, you'll have Bombfish before you get here, and it's only for a couple twist pumpkins. Not exactly what I would call an exciting reward. Another negative of this dungeon is that it loves forcing you to wait a surprising amount. Waiting for lava pillars to rise and fall, waiting for lava levels to raise and lower, waiting for hot air geysers to stop, and waiting for a ton of bomb fuses to go off. And that's not even to mention the boss fight here. Volvagia is easily the worst boss in this game. She has way too much health, loves wasting your time by constantly flying around, during which you can't deal damage to her, and the fight doesn't change at all for its entire duration. You have to get rid of this green crystal on her neck before you can damage her, and she gets it back every time she goes back into the lava, essentially giving her even more health. Not to mention, in phase 2, she only pops out from places where you can't hit her with your sword, forcing you to just shoot her with tons of arrows, which of course deal less damage, and thus drains more of your sword meter. You can actually bind the crystal and pull it off, which definitely speeds it up a bit, but not a lot since her health stat is just way too high, and again, you can't really attack her with your sword most of the time. Most echo summons are also surprisingly useless here, so if you're running out of the sword meter, have fun with this boss. Number 4, Southern Ruins. So here's the first dungeon in the game, and right off the bat it's notable because this is the same place the opening took place in, when you were playing as Link, and then ran away from a rift as Zelda. I like it a lot when previous locales get turned into a proper dungeon. Reminds me a lot of Forsaken Fortress from Wind Waker. Anyways, because this dungeon happens really early on in the game, it's pretty much a tutorial dungeon. So I feel like I can't be too harsh on it, but even so, the puzzles here, which again act more as tutorials, aren't so bad. I mean, there's still some interesting gameplay here, and for some of the puzzles you really gotta stop and think for a bit. First dungeons can easily fall in the trap of having all the puzzles be so boring and simple that the dungeon as a whole just becomes a slog to get through. Again, using Wind Waker as a comparison, that game's first dungeon, Dragon Roost Cavern, just ends up having almost no puzzles, and the ones it does have don't challenge the player, and their ideas don't get revisited in an interesting way. Zelda Ruins, on the other hand, both introduces mechanics and builds on them. For example, you learn how to use Bind here with a puzzle where you only have to move a rock, then you move a similar rock out the way, but you can also use it as a platform to reach a bonus chest, for which you also have to use Bind to pull it out of the ground. Then you learn to use it in a 2D segment by moving a boulder, then you solve a little puzzle with it where you have to pull a shield off a statue, which you can then later do to Link in the mini-boss, showing you that Bind can also have combat uses, which is actually the weakness of the following enemies, Dekubabas, showing you that some enemies can be beaten by using exclusively Bind. And all that might encourage you to try finding some other combat uses for Bind, like summoning these slow Darknut echoes you get here and moving them in and out of attack range with Bind. The way this ability gets introduced and taught to the player in this dungeon is very well done, and they just offer some solid and fun puzzles with it as well. But if I can complain for a moment, I don't really like how reverse Bind is handled here. You get access to it near the end where you have to use it on a moving platform to get across a gap. And then the next use for it is basically the same thing, and that's the last time you have to use it in the dungeon. There is a bonus chest here which the game wants you to use reverse bind for, but the chest pops into view before the moving platform you'd have to use reverse bind on. So I feel like most players will just grab the chest with normal bind before even realizing they weren't supposed to get it that way. And even then, wow, really, they want you to use it on a third moving platform? Do something else, man. The bonus chest for normal bind had you use a rock you already finished a puzzle with as a platform to get to it. I get that reverse bind inherently has less uses, but like, show me that I can use it on enemies or something. Something else I find a little off about this dungeon is that once again it gives you an echo early on that's way too powerful, the Strantula, which also trivializes any platforming challenges you could have had here, as it just summons a spider web you can climb all the way to the ceiling. For example, there's this giant wall by a slope with a chest behind it that could have been used to challenge the player with some interesting echo uses, but no, you can just use one Strantula to get over it. Luckily, this isn't a problem for long because it only works in places with ceilings, aka every dungeon after this, and because shortly after this you get something that's way more broken anyways. So yeah, goodbye Strantula. Last thing here, I like the boss Seismic Talus. It's not really a challenging fight, which makes sense for the first boss, but it's cool how you can either just walk up to its weak point and slash it, or you can pull it off with bind, which you eventually have to do for the later phases as it keeps getting higher up on its body. For the final phase, it's even on top of its head, forcing you to wait for a specific attack to let you reach it. It's also just neat how the dungeon had tons of instances of pulling stuff with bind beforehand, since it comes back in the boss fight here. If they didn't do that, I could easily see first time players get stuck here, as they didn't realize they could pull stuff off of enemies with bind. Number 3, Hyrule Castle. Once again, this is an area you've gone through before, but I think it's a lot cooler here because there's a lot more time between your first visit at the start of the game and your second visit when it's after 3 whole dungeons. Anyways, this is probably the dungeon with the least going on. It's the only one without a real gimmick, and for the most part, the puzzles here are just fine. What really carries this dungeon for me though is a lot of little things. For example, like I said, it's cool that this is a place you've been to before, and it's expanded on a lot. Story-wise, it's cool to see your father, the King of Hyrule, who previously sacrificed himself to save you. And similarly, I love that you can see Impa locked up in a cell after she stopped some guards to save you at the start of the game. It's especially cool that you can see she's been keeping a journal about her finding out you're still alive, and what you've accomplished to what you heard from the guards. You can also go into Zelda's bedroom, which has nothing to find, but it's a cool detail. You can even see your cat stuck in the still world, which motivates me infinitely more to clear this dungeon since I love cats. Fun fact, I have a cat in real life named Zelda. If this isn't the most fitting video to mention her, I don't know what is. Beyond that, the dungeon just consists of some platforming rooms that I don't really have a lot to say about. I like these enemies that shoot air in a circle and you gotta fly into the airstreams to gain height and then soar across it with a flying enemy echo. It's also cool that they bring back the stealth section from the start, which they actually focus on a lot. But here's where my main problem with the dungeon comes in. Can you guess what it is? That's right, it's the goddamn water block echo. More than any other place in the game, the water block echo ruins what could have been here. The entire stealth segment is a joke because you can just go past it all with water block echoes. There's a whole dark 2D underwater maze segment that's pretty fun, but it's all to reach a stealth section that's just for reaching a button on a high platform that you can just skip easily with water block echoes. And again, everyone will have it by this point since this dungeon comes after Jabul Ruins. Other than that, the dungeon is pretty straightforward, with nothing too exciting happening. But one thing I absolutely love about it is that when you get the big key, the music changes to be way more intense. Take a listen. It doesn't last that long since the run up to the boss isn't that far from the chest, but man, I think it's so cool. I never thought of that, and I hope it becomes a staple in the series going forward. Kinda surprising that this is the only dungeon in this game where it happens. Speaking of the boss, it's against Ganon. I don't really like Ganon's inclusion in this game for dumb lore reasons, but I promise I won't hold that against the dungeon. The fight itself is pretty good. It's a very standard Ganon fight. It's actually very similar to the fight at the start of the game when you were playing as Link, except he has way more health and a couple new moves. I like the fight, but it's sad how little it changes throughout. He pauses the gameplay to scream 3 separate times, which would make you think this fight has 4 phases, which I guess is true, but he almost fights the exact same way in each of them. I think he can't use his spear throw until phase 2, and Deadman's Folly until phase 3, but that still leaves a whole 4th phase which doesn't change at all. Maybe the lightning tennis gets a bit more intense, but I don't think that justifies a whole phase. As it is, I like the fight, but I think it takes a little too long, and while including Deadman's Volley is of course a classic for Ganon fights, I don't know how fitting this game is for it specifically, since you have a time limit on your sword mode, and it of course takes a while. Luckily I was more than prepared for this, but running out of sword meter in the middle of a fight and having to slowly replenish it by waiting for those crystals to spawn is an extremely unfun time. And I can't imagine Echoes being very effective in this fight, considering how often Ganon teleports around the arena. Number 2, Lanayru Temple. Now we're finally getting into the dungeons that I am mostly positive on. Kinda sucks that it's only the top 2, but whatever, I guess I'm hard to please. The main mechanic here are these elemental orbs that you have to put on pedestals to either thaw out or freeze rooms that have these fans in them. Again, I gotta praise how well this mechanic is introduced. The first room you enter in the dungeon has one of those giant fans on the walls, and the metal plating coming from it leads to the room on the right, connecting to this pedestal. And the only other thing in this room is a fire elemental orb on a similar pedestal, so you don't have a lot of options aside from moving the orb onto the other pedestal, showing you that it heats up the room with the fan in it melting the ice. A couple rooms later you see a locked door, a key for said locked door under some ice, and one of those fans that once again leads to an adjacent room. So you gotta go into it and once again try putting the fire orb on the pedestal, likely going through the icy geyser in the way, showing you that doing so turns it into an ice orb. So you try again, but this time avoiding the geyser, once again melting the ice and letting you grab the key under the water you just thawed out. But now you can't get to the locked door because the ice you could walk on before is gone now, and at this point you might remember that you were able to turn the fire orb into an ice orb. So you go back, this time doing so intentionally, which of course refreezes the water in the room, letting you get up to the locked door. Really smart way of introducing the concept. After this, the dungeon mostly consists of puzzles that I don't have a lot to say about. I like this 2D room where you have to take advantage of icicles to dodge the icy wind. I like these buttons where you have to press them at the same time, even though it surprisingly only comes back one more time. And I like this 2D room where you gotta light a couple candles to progress. One thing I want to point out in this room is that I'm pretty sure it has the only required use of being able to partially charge how far you want to summon an echo. You need to get it past this grating, but do it too far and it gets blown away by the wind. Like seriously, I completed this whole game and I don't think you ever need to partially charge anywhere else. Correct me if I'm wrong. Anyways, something I really do hold against this dungeon is a similar problem I had with Jabul Ruins, and that is that it once again gives you a way too powerful echo beforehand. This time the Cloud Echo, which is just a floating platform that allows you to fly. Like, you can literally go anywhere with it. To get to the dungeon, you have to go through a 2D cave, which is boring as hell because you just fly to the exit. But why even bother with that when you can just skip it entirely and fly directly to where the cave would lead to anyways, and then keep flying until you reach the dungeon. At the end of the game, to get to Null's body, you have to go through a massive still world section that's a mashup of every location in the game, which is really cool, but why bother with that when you can just fly past all of it? Seriously, I'd say this is the second most overpowered echo in the game after the water block, of course. The only thing keeping it somewhat in check is the fact that you can't get it until at least halfway through the story, and that it doesn't have any combat uses. Back to the dungeon, a couple rooms just get completely trivialized by this echo. There's a room where you have to transport a fire orb across a big pit, past lots of traps and enemies, so you can either brute force it or go in without the orb first to neutralize all the threats. The choice here is cool, but again, it's all to cross a big pit, so you can just fly over it with clouds instead. And something I really hate is that you're even rewarded for doing this on 2 separate occasions. Once with a hidden treasure room that's pretty high up, and once more to reach a purple rupee at the height limit of a room here. Again, I don't think the "if you don't like it, don't use it" argument is a good excuse. The game gives you this option and expects you to use it. If you get put in a Coliseum deathmatch against a WWE World Champion, and you're given 3 weapons to choose from, either a spoon, a feather, or a shotgun, you're gonna pick the shotgun. Luckily, the last third of this dungeon focuses on this massive multi-room puzzle spanning an entire floor with multiple of those fire and ice orbs. Most puzzles here are great, and it's very satisfying to come up with what to do, especially when you realize you have to go back to some fans a couple times to change the elemental orb. I don't got any complaints here. When it comes to the required fights though, this dungeon is kind of a mixed bag. For starters, I really like the mini-boss. Being a big slime monster you gotta freeze and then hit, which keeps splitting it up into smaller pieces you gotta freeze and destroy again. It's a lot of fun to summon tons of ice echoes here to try and freeze as many of the blobs as possible. And I love that some segments even jump in the hot spring water in the room to shoot water blast onto their frozen friends to thaw them out. It ends up becoming a super frantic fight and I like it a lot. I do wonder though what would happen if you got to this fight without any ice enemy echoes. It's not likely, but I think you would get soft locked here. The same issue is present to a bigger degree for the boss, Scorchill. It starts off wearing an ice helmet and literally nothing except fire attacks will do anything to him. Specifically fire attacks to its helmet, which is pretty high up. You did have to use fire earlier in this dungeon, but what if you never echoed something that can hit him high up like a fire whiz rope or fire keys? It's entirely possible. Besides that, I think the boss fight is just fine. He's got a fun gimmick where he keeps switching between fire and ice forms, but I can't help but be disappointed by the third phase, where he wears a helmet of both elements and switches his weakness back and forth. He can spit both fire and ice in this phase, so I think it would have been more interesting if when he was in his ice form you had to lure him into his own fire, and vice versa for his fire form. It's not a bad fight though, but my favorite part about it is actually how he's built up before the dungeon even starts, thanks to my goat, Condi, whose father died and his brother hasn't returned from his adventure, making him lonely. You then find out his brother is stuck in the still world, and Condi runs into an evil echo of his brother that hits him, making him confused as to why his brother suddenly hates him. Then in the still world, you find a mural left behind by his actual brother, saying that he can't wait to take Condi on adventures with him. I think it's a fun way to build up a boss, but I can't help but be disappointed that we never get to see Condi's actual brother. We know what he looks like thanks to the clone, but we never get to see him stuck in the still world like with Lord Jabu Jabu, and we don't even get to know his name. The boss is called Scorchill, but come on, that can't be the actual brother's name, right? It's a combination of Scorch and Chill, because he uses fire and ice in his fight. The closest we get is a picture in the credits where we see his brother returning in a hot air balloon, but even then we don't get to see him. Still a fun storyline though, and I think it elevates the dungeon a bit. Number 1, Pharaon Temple. And now we're finally at the whole reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. Up until now, I've honestly been pretty negative on the dungeons in this game, but this one is on a whole other level. This isn't a tier list video, but if it was, it would look something like this, except with like 3 tiers in between this and the Neri Temple. Seriously, I think Echoes of Wisdom's Pharaon Temple is among the best Zelda dungeons ever made, so let's just dive into it. When you approach the dungeon, you see the boss key chest sitting outside of it, but then it gets stolen by a plant monster that flees inside, so you chase it to find yourself in the first room where you're barred off from the rest of the dungeon. You can't do anything here. So with no other options, you decide to leave the dungeon, and this is where the amazing gimmick comes in. If you explore around a bit, you might find another entrance, which shows you that you're back in the Pharaon Temple. And that's because besides the main entrance, this dungeon has 6 other entrances, and you can start with any of them because this dungeon is insanely open. But because you were teased with the boss key being stolen at the start, your goal remains the same regardless: track down the boss key, which you can start doing from any of the entrances because of the open design. Seriously, this is one of the best ideas for a Zelda dungeon ever, and on top of that, it's also super smartly designed. As usual, you need small keys to get to places you have to reach, in this case to get to Manhandla, the monster that took the boss key. But all the keys are available to you at the start, you just gotta find them. One of the small keys even leads to a single room with a useless treasure in it, making it so not all locked doors signal which way to go, as that would otherwise go against the open design. What's also really smart is that when you beat it, it runs away and you gotta find it a second time, for which you need another small key. Which is so smart because otherwise the only way this dungeon could have worked is if they just locked a single fight against Manhandla behind all 3 locked doors, and you just had to get all 3 keys before being able to get to the boss key. Ironically, if they did this, it still would have been a great dungeon, but because you have to fight Manhandla twice in different locations, it allows them to leave the dungeon entirely open to explore, making it a different experience every time you play it. In fact, in my first playthrough, I accidentally found all 3 keys before using any of them, meaning I was able to do the first Manhandla fight while already having the tools required to reach the second one, because I explored the whole dungeon beforehand, which was cool. Players who didn't get every key before the first Manhandla fight would still have some exploring left to do after having reached what they'd assume was their main goal, that being Manhandla, since you gotta find it twice, which would also be cool. It's such a smart way of making sure every type of player has to experience everything this dungeon has to offer, regardless of the order they do it in. You might remember that Gerudo Sanctum actually had a similar idea to this dungeon. There, you also had to go outside to find a different entrance. But I said there that it's kinda disappointing because you just leave once to get a couple things and then you just go back in for the rest of the dungeon. Here, you're actually encouraged to go outside and enter from a different entrance constantly. One of the entrances even leads to a room where you can't access the rest of the dungeon, but you still need to go to it because it has a small key in it. A small downside of this design is that it's entirely possible to end up in a room you've already cleared, just from a different entrance. But I don't think that's a big deal at all, because you can just quickly leave. You probably just open the shortcut anyways. And in this game you can actually warp to different points in the dungeon if you found the warp points. And this dungeon is very generous with its warp points, by the way, so that's great design too. I also love that the dungeon map isn't just handed to you, and because of the dungeon's design, it feels like an actual great reward to find, since it allows you to plan a route to take, and you can actually see which exits leads to which part of the dungeon's exterior, allowing you to get around even faster. Now this gimmick is great and all, but what is a good dungeon without actual good rooms? And luckily, this dungeon has those in spades. There are a couple of these dark rooms that I think are super atmospheric, especially because of this game's great lighting engine. I also absolutely love that if you want to, you can illuminate these rooms by finding and lighting all the torches in it, which would obviously help you get around quicker, but you don't have to do it. It's entirely optional for players that want to better see where they're going, and it can actually come in handy in one of them because it has these crystals that you gotta power with electricity on a time limit, so obviously being able to see would help a ton here. By the way, these green electricity crystals are expertly taught to you during the run-up of this dungeon, but that's par for the course at this point for this game, it's just worth mentioning of course. I'm also pretty sure this is the only place in the whole game with these giant weight puzzles, which I really like. They lend themselves very well to a game where you can just summon stuff with different weight values. I especially like the one where you have to equalize the weight between you and an Armos, so you can both press a button at the same time. Shoutouts to this one 2D water puzzle where you have to move an Armos in a specific way so you can pass, which I actually got stuck on for an embarrassing amount of time in my first playthrough. If I can say something negative about this dungeon, it's that I don't think the second Manhandla fight is all that great. The first time you fight it, it only has green heads, which you can just hit with your sword, but in the second fight it has these blue heads that you can't damage, so you gotta pull them, which exposes their weak points on the necks. This would be fine, but the problem is that the weak points are only there while you're pulling on the heads, meaning you'd have to rely on your echoes to hit it, but for some reason their AI just loves going for the head anyways, even though it can't take damage, while the actual weak point is right there and they just ignore it. It gets pretty frustrating if I'm honest. I eventually tried placing a bombfish and pulling their weak points over it, which didn't work since the explosions were too low, but through this I did accidentally discover that if they eat a bombfish, they also get stunned, letting you attack the weak point yourself. Maybe this is the intended way to fight them, but somehow I doubt that since A, you never need to use explosives anywhere else in this dungeon, and B, you normally always have to fight these Deku Baba-like enemies by pulling their heads. The poor Echo AI is literally my only problem with this fight, and by extension the whole dungeon. Luckily, the boss, Goma, makes up for it for the most part. I love this boss a lot because just like the dungeon itself, you got multiple intended ways of tackling it and none of them are wrong. You can either light the 3 crystals on her body with electric keys while she's on the wall to stun it, or you can wait for a specific attack while she's on the grounds that leaves her open for you to light the crystals with buzz blobs to stun her, or you can try to shoot her eyeball while it's open during her laser attack to stun her. To be fair, that last one seems to be a little finicky, but I'd be lying if I said its inconsistency didn't make it more intense. I also like how the boss brings the dungeon full circle. She can spawn these little baby Goma eggs that you previously found in and around the dungeon, and she can spawn these spider webs which you can burn for better movement, something else you had to do in the dungeon. What's also really cool is that the boss actually gets foreshadowed as soon as you enter Scrubton, since the Deku Scrubs seem to be obsessed with cotton candy made from spider webs. One of the scrubs even refers to the Great Spider who made the spider webs for the candy, obviously being Goma. And of course, you can find a ton of baby gomas throughout the dungeon hatching from eggs. Those eggs gotta come from somewhere, am I right? To wrap this segment up, Echoes of Wisdom's Pharaon Temple is incredible, and if the next 3D Zelda game goes open world again, which it probably will, I would love for them to tackle this idea again. I think it'd work way better as a dungeon in an open world game than just giving you a couple goddamn terminals to go to. This is how you make an open dungeon. So now let's finally circle back to the question I asked at the start of this video. Are Zelda dungeons finally good again? No. It's complicated. Look, I don't think the dungeons in this game are all bad. If we're simply comparing them to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons, then yeah, I'd say these are a massive step in the right direction. But you've probably noticed by now that I think most of these dungeons suffer from this game's philosophy of letting puzzles be solved in whatever way the player comes up with. It was a fun idea back when Breath of the Wild came out, but by now I'm not scared to admit that I really don't like this idea of making puzzles, even outside of dungeons. With jigsaw puzzles, there is only one way to solve them, and the fun comes in you figuring out what that specific solution is. Giving players a literal warehouse of options and just letting them do whatever works is just not satisfying. It makes success feel inevitable as long as you just try everything. And it's worse when balance isn't taken into consideration, which was clearly the case with Echoes of Wisdom when you look at the water block echo. I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing me bringing this thing up, but I legit think having an option that works in almost every situation is just not good design. You know the saying, the journey is the reward? With puzzle design like this, it feels more like the reward is the reward. The journey can't be the reward since they didn't design one. You have to design the journey, which is boring. People rightfully rag on the skybike in Tears of the Kingdom a lot because it's so easy to make and it trivializes the entire exploration part of the game. But the difference is that people still had to come up with that, and there are places where it's literally not an option, such as in shrines. You need to find different solutions there. The water block is like if the skybike was just a summonable item you get at the start. It's just given to you, it breaks the game open right out the gate, and you can use it everywhere. And it only gets better as you get access to more tries, thus letting you spawn more water blocks. And the worst part is that it would have been so easy to balance. Remove its ability to be stacked by just placing it in the same spot. Make its uses more limited by, for example, making it evaporate on the spot if you try using it in the hot volcano or desert areas, or making it freeze instantly when placing it in cold areas, which by the way actually does happen if you place it in freezing water, just not cold areas in general. The Cloud Echo honestly just should not have been in the game in the first place, but even here it could have been limited. Its description says that the still world has petrified this cloud into something you can stand on for a while. So then why does it work outside the still world as well? I'm really not expecting most people to agree with me, and I want to make it as clear as possible that I like Echoes of Wisdom. It's a good game, but the dungeons in it once again disappointed me. I don't think they're totally terrible or anything, obviously, but man, I'm just so tired of this new design philosophy the Zelda series has now, and I personally think the game suffers a lot from it. Well, this video got a lot more negative than I initially thought it would, but regardless, shoutouts to the Flying Fire, Giant Firing Coal, Quote is Cool, LurFX1, Sheen for the Win, ExoBear, Lime the Chef, Gurk, Still700, and the rest of my Patreon supporters. I actually moved out a while back, so seriously, more than ever, your guys' support is insanely appreciated. If you guys like my content, please consider checking out my Patreon page. Rent prices are fucking insane. Big thanks also to you for watching to the end, and Infinity Nikki for sponsoring this video as well. Leave a like, a comment, maybe even subscribe, all that good stuff, and please have a great rest of your day.